usually generally use this time to sort of turn it up a bit. And what we're going to be turning up is not volume, but clarity. And there are different kinds of fields that we're all transmitting to each other all the time. We're always transmitting our state to each other. So you can notice that if you're in the presence of somebody who's depressed, you get depressed, unless you don't like them, and then you get happy. But that's another kind of transmission. Generally, one of the fields that I've tried to work with a lot is just simply clarity. It's a form of Dharmakaya, and so generally, when you're working with union of emptiness and forms, union of emptiness and clarity. So emptiness is the open and spaciousness that we briefly sort of talked about, in which everything is arising and freely, spontaneously self-liberating. So there's no friction, there's nothing sticking. And that includes your own body-mind is arising and freely and not sticking. And then in the midst of that, clarity and luminosity. And that's one of the things that we want to try to do, because we find that without clarity, without a way to tie together the insights that you're getting, we've learned the very hard way over 30 years that without a framework, it won't stick. It's just really that simple. And even to the point where a lot of spiritual teachers are saying that their own spiritual realization is deepened by just reading the Akko framework. So the framework per se isn't the source of that realization, although in some sense it can really activate it. But it's the combination of your own direct awakening awareness in as wide a framework as we can. The combination of those two is what helps to deepen your own realization in your own practice. So some people say, well, I don't know, framework, that's kind of heady. And the answer is, well, you have a framework anyway, only it's probably really crappy. And so what we want to try to do is just upgrade that. And you're welcome to stick with your own framework, you know. But obviously we're here to try to give you what we believe is the most up-to-date integral framework. And then you can check it. You can don't by any means simply accept this, obviously, on authority. I don't think any of you are that type. I don't think you'd be here if that was the case. So you do want to go ahead and run it by your own discriminating awareness and intelligence. And then let that be part of the organizing frame that you can use to deepen your own realization and also find the pattern that connects the aspects of your life. And what an integral framework does is basically incidentally what happens is this arm won't, you lose the deltoid muscle, so I can't move this arm. So it's like, I'm always moving this is around like this. And like David Data said, the thing he was most upset is that I can neither type nor masturbate. And I haven't decided which bothers me the most, except I am on 3 deadlines. So I've decided typing temporarily, it bothers me the most. But we did work up kind of a little keyboard thing now. So for the last 4 days, I've been back to my normal schedule. I'm getting up around 2 o'clock. I write for 4 or 5 hours. And just now finishing the original version of Integral Spirituality, which sort of came through in about a 4-day period right before the event of the gathering of Integral Spiritual Center. It's a great book. It's going to come in at about 250 pages. So that I'm a little bit behind on that. I had a deadline on the many faces of terrorism, Integral Spirituality, and a 60-page foreword to Transformations of Consciousness. And I was sitting on all of these deadlines when I ran into the wooden floor. Now, it was a head-to-head-on collision with this oak floor. Now, most people can't have a head-to-head-on collision with a floor, but that's because they're limited in their imaginative capacities. So I did about a 60-mile-an-hour smack into this floor. Hopefully you don't lose too much of a sense of humor in the midst of that, because humor is really a measure of emptiness. It's a measure of how much you can simply let the play arise. There are times, clearly, when you lose your sense of humor. Some of these things just, it's a challenge. But it's also I was talking with several people about it, just in terms of talking about gross, subtle, and causal bodies. It actually turns out any of these kinds of things, and you all have had similar experiences, but once you start to do some of the integral kata, learn to kind of feel the difference between your gross physical body and your subtle body and your causal body, which extends to infinity. It's almost like a layer cake when you have something that they're all lighting up so intensely differently. You can really get a texture of them. So in the gross body, you're being tortured. And the subtle body, there's still a radiance. The causal body, there's an infinite release. And so there's a humor about it. So you can really kind of feel yourself going up and down this layer cake. And you hope that you spend more time in the upper layers than in the lower. But even the lower pain is not supposed to go away. I mean, if that's what's happening, that's what's happening. But your capacity to sort of deal with it, fortunately, gets more profound the more you can do these things. And so, as you'll see, what we want to try to do is bring lightness and clarity into a situation. And that also means the patterns that connect, in addition to, hopefully, a little bit of the humor of everything that's arising. Enlightenment restores humor. And ultimately, there is simply the vast witness of everything that's arising. And then there's Leela, the sport, the play, the joke of manifestation. And so both of those are something you want to get in touch with. And then, of course, you can be very sincere and very serious if necessary. But hopefully there's a background of lightness that pervades things as well.
Hi, Ken. I'm Edwin.
Hi.
My question might seem a little off the wall, but I'd put it in context of, just attempting to understand how things will evolve.
Yeah.
You talk a lot about, in terms of spiral dynamics, a planetary level, so beige to green repeating at a planetary level. At some point in time, you watch Star Wars and you begin to think, well, maybe there's an interplanetary evolution that will take place.
Yeah.
So do you see this thing just constantly just repeating?
This thing being something like the levels.
The beige to green at, so Darth Vader is like a red at the interplanetary level, right?
Yeah, well, Darth Vader, there's states and stages, yes. Well, you actually touch on a very good question, because when we were Earth-centric and developed the whole great metaphysical and spiritual systems, the idea was that any of the forms that human beings express were somehow archetypal. In other words, they were fixed for all time, they were Platonic forms, they were unalterable and unchangeable for all of manifestation. Now, as soon and if we ever run into another civilization, and assuming we can communicate to some degree, and I suspect we can probably at least through mathematics. But if that happens, we're going to find out just what is, happens just to be Earth forms, and what is actually might be the structure of manifestation itself. So it's a repeat on a broad scale of what happens when the great lineages developed in China over here, India over here, Turkey over here, Germany over here, and so on. When they ran into each other, we got to start comparing and say, okay, wait a minute, what actually is universal to humans, and what is simply a product of Tibetan culture, or just Japanese culture, and so on. And it's very, very difficult, because, when I was studying Zen, it became pretty clear everybody faces this question, the first generation studying with Eastern teachers. We used to say in Zen that half of what we were getting was Dharma, pure truth. The other half was Japanese militaristic, patriarchal, sexist bullshit. And we weren't sure which half. So it complicated the process. And if you talk with Genpo Roshi, and if you talk with Tetsugen, Bernie Tetsugen, his comrade, they had to face this very difficult decision. And the way they summarized it was, they decided to swallow the whole fish. In other words, when we're making that jump from one culture to another, you're not allowed to make that kind of question, because you practice really, you have to get right mind to mind with your teacher. And if you're always gainsaying it, saying, oh no, that's culture, I don't have to believe that, it's not going to work. And so at some point they had to swallow the whole fish. And then once you get lineage transmission, which they both have, then you can start to say, wait a minute, I don't think this is just, universal. I think this is just Japanese. And I'm not going to teach that as part of Dharma, because I don't think it's part of Dharma. Only lineage holders can do that. We're not allowed to come in from the outside and do that. You have to swallow the whole fish to do it. The question then becomes, if you swallow the whole fish, are you capable of making the discrimination? I mean, the anti-pornographers apparently would face the same problem. They say that if you see pornography, it ruins your judgment. Well, how do they know, since they're watching pornography? I mean, so you don't know how, if you actually swallow it, are you then in a position of making that, but you're the only one that can do it. At some point now, we put all this sort of cross-cultural stuff together, and that's sort of what Integral does. And we say, wait a minute, here's the frameworks. Here's what all of them at some level have in common. If we put them all together, and some of them, not necessarily every tradition has all of them, but we make a composite map. We say, here's the best guess of what is present universally. And that means it's the best guess to your own potentials, to something that is going to light up in you if you start looking for it. And that's what we use Aqua for. Now, the first time the first Martians or Alpha Centaurians or whatnot show up, and they have 7 quadrants, and we're going to go, okay, and readjust. So we don't know, but that's extremely important, where we can't take the forms that show up as Platonic eternal givens. And the way we do it in Aqua is we make it just part of an evolutionary unfolding. And then it becomes a cosmic memory or cosmic habit for this Earth. Now, is it really present elsewhere? We're going to find out. The only thing, so Star Trek, and this is like particularly Captain Picard, right? And the only thing I find disturbing about that is like hundreds of years in the future, and they still haven't found a cure for baldness. And I'm wondering, what the hell kind of civilization is that? And God, that's very depressing. So, but it's very important, because it's not off the wall. Are these forms, and every major spiritual tradition has some form of archetypes, or the logos that became flesh, or alaya vijnana. I mean, you can go right across the board, none are without them. And all of them say they are the eternal form of spirit's structure as it manifests. It's probably not. It doesn't mean that you can't use them to liberate you, because as long as they're transpersonal in some extent, it doesn't matter how they got there. If you plug into it, you can transcend yourself. What we haven't transcended will be the subtle ways of earthbound consciousness that, by definition, we're fish in water, and we'll never know that until another life form shows up. That'd be very, very interesting.